The world had learned to sleep with one ear to the ocean and the other to the jungle. Tremors that once read as earthquakes had names now: Godzilla, Kong, and nations built protocols and prayers around their coming. A splotch of green and stone, a place where weather ran wild and compasses went to die. In the hume of research vessels and the static of military channels, Kong was still called a king, not because anyone had coronated him in any human ritual, but because he carried sovereignty the way a heartbeat does, steady, stubborn, alive. Kong moved through his island as a problem solver. He remembered places, patterns, human faces. He learned tools the way a child learns speech. He could take a fallen tree and, with the patience of a carpenter, fashion something that multiplied his force. He could read the angle of a cliff and know, without calculation, how to launch himself so that the weight of his body became a lever. His strength was intimate muscle braided with reflex. The humans who had watched him up close learned to call him clever and morally legible. In small, fierce ways, Kong resembled humanity: curiosity, grief, attachment. He could defend a valley from a predator and weep over a lost companion. He was the kind of giant that made people hope because he seemed to understand why they were worth protecting. Godzilla was not built for hope. He arrived in the world like a geological verdict, a slow and ancient calculus. He carried the smell of deep water and ionized wind. His presence rearranged storms. Where Kong was local and intimate, Godzilla was planetary in scale. He dragged centuries behind him like a cloak, nuclear fire in his breath, armor of scales that had been forged against missiles and the sun, an appetite calibrated not to slaughter but to regulate. In the lit rooms of policy briefings and in the whispered tents of island elders, a theory had hardened. Godzilla was not merely a predator. He functioned like an immune response, an agent that reasserted balance when systems tilted toward catastrophic disequilibrium. When the Earth's chemical heart burned wrong, Godzilla's interventions were violent but purposeful. Those who studied these titans found themselves arguing over definitions that philosophers had argued for centuries. The ethicists and field scientists sat shoulder to shoulder with a sort of impatient philosopher, someone who insisted on asking what winning actually meant. Was it survival of the single body who struck the last blow? Was it the preservation of an ecology that could feed millions? Was moral worth measured by empathy or by function? Dr. Amara Levy, a biologist whose hands were always stained with seawater and lab ash, said bluntly that the question was empirical. Godzilla's atomic breath, his regenerative tissues, the way he absorbed radiation and redistributed it. These were not mere weapons, they were mechanisms of planetary scale. If unchecked, nuclear blight or monstrous invasive species threatened biomes, a being that could reset however destructively served a telos. Telos was an old word, Aristotelian and unsparing, an end toward which a thing naturally moves. In that frame, Godzilla's telos was systemic equilibrium. An elder from Skull Island spoke in a different register. He had watched Kong since his infancy, had taught the islanders how not to anger him, how to feed him with reverence. He said that the island required guardians who could feel. Kong's intelligence meant he could be social, could bargain for coexistence, could be taught to protect a village rather than flatten it. His victories could be moral victories, because they preserved particular communities. A military planner, leaning on data maps, shrank both philosophies to numbers. Casualties, GDP hit, migration patterns. Godzilla's interventions cost cities. Kong's costs, when realized, were smaller and more localized. Utilitarian calculus favored the regulator if the scale of damage prevented an ecological catastrophe. Kantian duty, by contrast, refused to reduce a sentient being, Kong included, to a mere means. Rights, dignity, the lived experience of creatures that could suffer, those counted for something, the elder argued. These debates were not academic humdrum, they seeded strategy. If Kong could be reasoned with, outfitted, placed where he could defend without annihilating, then human agency could tilt the outcome. If Godzilla was the planet's immune response, any attempt to destroy him would be like attacking a symptom by cutting the patient. The core issue reduced to scale versus nuance. Does the world require a brute regulator who restores balance at any cost, or a clever protector who can ally with communities and thereby preserve diversity? Beyond philosophy, the feats themselves had to be weighed without sentiment. Kong's record, Feats of dexterity and improvisation, hand-to-hand combat with monsters twice his size, when the environment favored ambush, the creative use of tools, a carved axe that had cleaved through armored hide, an ability to climb and use vertical terrain as a force multiplier. He bled like an animal, he could be wounded, and he would heal, but not with the clinical speed of something that carries nuclear energy in its veins. Godzilla's list read like a myth penned by physicists, a body that endured bunker-busting warheads, an atomic breath that lanced through steel and stone, regenerative capacities that stitched tissue under radiation, the capacity to move through ocean depths at speeds that bent sonar, and a connection to forces that felt empirically and culturally primordial. He was less agile on uneven urban rooftops. He could not climb the cliffs of Skull Island with Kong's ease. But in open confrontation, where tidal surges and atmospheric ionization played to his favor, Godzilla's reach was existential. By the time the ships left the last safe harbor and scouts radioed tremors from the deep, the human chorus had exhausted itself on definitions and returned to the only kind of certainty that mattered. A map of likely outcomes, strategic placements, and the brute fact that two very different kinds of sovereignty were about to collide. The choice of battlefield would matter. Coastline, city, island, because each amplified different truths. Kong could turn a ruined skyscraper into a catapult. Godzilla could turn an ocean into an arsenal. The philosophers argued until there was nothing left to say, and then the world held its breath and listened for the roar that would decide which teleology, that of a local king or of a planetary immune system, would write itself into history. They met where land unmade itself into sea, a ragged shelf of limestone and sand at the edge of a city built to defy tides. Night happened in frames, lightning, then blackness, then the puncture of Godzilla's roar that set the gulls on fire. Kong climbed the exposed ribs of a ruined cable bridge and stared at the thing that floated like a mountain in the surf. He had scars. The wind smelled of salt and solder. He adjusted the haft of his axe and tested his hands against the steel cable. His eyes were human in their wariness and animal in their hunger. Godzilla advanced with the economy of tectonics. His first step made the bay boil. His dorsal plates pulsed faintly, an index of the power running up his spine. The air grew metallic. Where Kong's strikes had once toppled a predator, here they would batter a force whose blood hummed with raw radiation. Kong leapt, a fall of living iron, and landed a strike that rocked Godzilla's flank. It was a contact that registered pain, perhaps, but Godzilla's response was geological. A breath culled from the cores of suns, a beam that painted the night into daytime and slammed into the bridge where Kong crouched. Kong's lungs filled with smoke. The axe became a shield and then a laver. He survived the first atomic lash by turning the moment into momentum. He smashed pillars, sending debris into Godzilla's face. The beast staggered but did not fall. He submerged into the surf and let the city's lights cut off like a constellation being snuffed. The sea rose as Godzilla surged. Tidal waves corkscrewed into streets, and Kong found himself fighting not just the beast but physics, caught on the wrong side of a wall of water that rearranged his very footing. Kong fought like an idea given muscle, improvisation where science favored brute force. He drew Godzilla onto land, into broken glass and angled steel. He used the city's skeleton to swing, to vault, to strike at eyes and gills. He learned through impact, always adapting. He became guerrilla warfare incarnate, an insurgent of flesh in a theater designed for artillery. For every brutal breath Godzilla loosed, Kong answered with a cleverness that made onlookers believe, briefly, that the fight could be won. Godzilla answered not with fury alone, but with economy. He drew on reserves the city could not imagine. His atomic breath was not merely a weapon to be fired. It was a process of energetics, the absorption of stray radiation, the resonance of his plates like a power transformer, the conversion of ambient chemical imbalances into force. He pulsed, and sand ignited, and instruments that measured the electromagnetic field screamed into silence. He was always, inexorably, the environment's corrective. The city was a test tube, and Godzilla the catalyst. Kong landed blows that dented bone and splintered plate. He drove his axe into the interspaces between Godzilla's plates and felt the vibration of something vast. The axe, for a moment, sang with the same frequency as Godzilla's pulse. It was a sacrament of proximity, the small thing touching the sublime. Kong's face was a study in refusal to flee, refusal to yield, every muscle a manifesto against inevitability. But nature scales. Godzilla could afford to lose scales and still keep his function. Radiation braided into him like a second blood, stitching wounds almost as they were opened. He could not be reasoned with. He did not bargain. Instead, he executed a final terrible economy, where Kong's strikes had sought to localize pain. Godzilla widened the scope of the contest until the arena itself became the instrument of decision. He drew energy from the ionized sky, from reactors damaged in the initial fallout, and he fed it into his dorsal lattice. The hum became a storm. The beast let out a sound that was not a roar so much as a planetary recalibration. Then he unleashed a pulse that was not simply a beam, but a field, ionizing, disorienting, an electromagnetic and nuclear wave that rolled like winter over everything Kong had become. Kong's muscles spasmed under the field. His axe slipped. For the first time in the battle, the heroic improvisation that had carried him so far could not find purchase. The environment that had once been his ally, steel girders to swing from, rubble to hurl, offered no leverage against an energy that rearranged matter at the atomic scale. He tried to close, to touch the beast's throat and stop the tide by force of will alone. He managed to punch, to wrench, to wrap an arm around a dorsal spike and clamp teeth into scale. He bled, he roared. In the interplay of their bodies there was a moment, brief, crystalline, where victory hovered like a coin spun on its edge. Then the coin fell. Godzilla, immense and balanced by forces far beyond muscle, reared and disgorged the concentrated core of his being. The atomic breath converged with a nuclear pulse that tore through flesh and bone, and through the very idea that a local solution could arrest a planetary response. Kong crumpled under the blow, not instantly, but with the inevitability of something utterly outscaled. He lay among the broken girders and rain, his chest heaving, his eyes still lucid with the stubborn intelligence that had made him a symbol. Godzilla did not dance a triumphant circle. He stood, breathing the dark air as if measuring its chemistry. His victory was not a celebration, it was a reassertion. He turned once toward the city, toward the humans who watched from bunkers, and there was something in that look that was not malice but an old indifferent stewardship. He slid back into the ocean the way a tide withdraws after rearranging a shoreline. When the dust and the radiation settled, the philosophers returned to their uneasy lectures. Some called it a tragedy. Kong, noble and intimate, felled by a force that could not be met on its own terms. Others said Godzilla's victory was the only kind the world could sustain, the organism that prevented the slow creeping death of ecosystems by reasserting balance in catastrophic but necessary ways. The utilitarians pointed to the logic of large systems, the deontologists mourned the loss of a sentient defender. Tell it like it is, Kong fought with every advantage his cunning could buy him, and almost changed the equation. He forced Godzilla to reveal what he truly was, not a mindless destroyer but an ecological regulator with access to energies that made conventional combat obsolete. The final calculus that decided the battle was simple and brutal: scale, energy and function. Kong's feats were heroic, yes, and the world lost something that night. But Godzilla's role, rooted in forces older than cities and philosophies, translated into victory because the planet's need for a corrective, even a violent one, outweighed the singular virtue of a guardian. In the aftermath, humans told stories of both. Children sketched Kong with a bandaged arm, scientists recalibrated climate models, and somewhere beyond the horizon, Godzilla moved, an exoskeleton of purpose, a verdict written in the language of storms. The winner had been declared not by malice or merit alone, but by the kind of necessity that bends outcomes, the planet's indifferent, inexorable requirement to be kept in balance.